We all know who we are, WILF, and this is our first webinar of the new year. And as you know, our history is more than 100 years, and we've been looking at the root causes of conflict. We've been campaigning against war, for disarmament and demilitarization, for equality and climate justice, but above all, women, peace and security is our overarching objective. And the Women, Peace and Security, WPS, it's known as familiarly, was passed at the Security Council in the year 2000 as Security Council Resolution 1325, and it establishes women's equal participation, protection and rights in conflict prevention and resolution and recovery, and it rests on the 4 pillars of participation, protection, rights in conflict prevention, and the resolution and recovery as its 4 pillars. Now it's supported by 10 further resolutions at the Security Council. So we know it has the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Now, our own Sophia from WILPF UK, Dr. Sophia Close is an expert in this area, and she's been working recently on completing in-depth research and on women, peace and security. And so no one is better at presenting it to us, because we feel that we know about it in general. We don't know enough about it in particular, so that we can go out there and campaign on it. So we've got about 90 minutes. We're recording this, and there'll be plenty of time after Sophia has spoken to ask questions and get into it further. So there you go, Sophia. It's over to you.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Sheila. I was about to say that it was too warm, in the sense that I feel that amongst our colleagues in WILPF UK, I'm not the most expert of the experts. So I will try my best to explain some acronyms, and I would really like this to be relaxed. I actually call it like a teach-in, in the sense that we're all learning together, and any questions that you have, just stop me and we can sort of work through that at the time, or if you want to sort of ask them in the round at the end, also go ahead and do that. Whatever you feel more would be more helpful and more useful to really unpacking what is this broad understanding of the WPS agenda and the sort of world of acronyms that surround it. So yeah, let's make it as open and, full of questions as we can. So I thought I do have a PowerPoint which I can share with you, and but if you ask any questions, I can bring it down and we can talk about it. Let me just start by sharing that. Oh, that's not helpful. Wait a second. Give me a moment. Can the host allow sharing for me? Is that all right? Have we got a host?
Yeah. Yes, it's Kat. She's doing it now.
Thanks, Kat. No rush, it's fine. So maybe I'll just sort of start with a big picture. So the WPS, Women, Peace and Security, so I'll use these acronyms after I've explained them, is really fundamental to feminist peace building work and the work of WILPF. Not only because WILPF, our sisters around the world, were very much part of actually creating the first resolution and subsequent resolutions, but because for us as WILPFers, it really is an official global recognition of the role that women peace builders have played for centuries, in that we understand that you cannot build sustainable peace without women's full participation, so meaningful participation. It's a term that's key to the WPS agenda, and I'll explain that as well, and that you cannot protect women's rights without addressing these root causes of violence and inequality, just as Sheila said. So the WPS agenda is a bridge between feminist activism and international policy, and also sort of human rights law, and the broader agenda. And it's a process that's sort of transformed grassroots women's peace building work into this global framework that now governments and other institutions are obligated to implement. So it's created this, in some senses, a formalization around the work that we do. And we can talk about it afterwards, because in some ways that formalization has been really important, but it's also been quite shallow and narrow and has been problematic.
Sophia, you should now be able to share your screen, just in case. I think I've done it.
I can, thank you. You've done it well, and I will do it. Can you see it now?
Yes, it's a bit small for us to take in.
Can you see it now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. So that was just my sort of introduction. And you know what? That means I've lost all my notes, but that's all right. So basically, the Women's Peace and Security Agenda is something that really highlights women's peace work, and for the first time, sort of globally, made it very much visible. And it also gave it a legitimacy in some institutions where that was not there yet, or in a systematic way. In particular, it also challenges militarized and patriarchal approaches to building peace, which are the sort of normal mechanisms that more regularly in place by these institutions. And so it provides this sort of really systematic challenge to that way of thinking and working. And as I said before, it connects local women's knowledge and practice, what we do, with the global policy environment. So it's really very fundamental and very important. So the WPS agenda didn't just start in 2000. It came from work that was being done globally, and more importantly, not just by women who were living in the global north, in Europe and in America and Canada and Australia, right? It came from really important processes like the Windhoek Declaration, the Namibia Plan. And actually, Namibia was one of the key states that brought forward 1325 into the UN and sort of championed it. So this is an important thing to sort of note, because often as part of the resistance against the WPS agenda, we're told this is a Western agenda, this is a Western framework, i.e. it doesn't relate to us in Uganda, it doesn't relate to us in Malaysia, it doesn't relate to us in Colombia. And that's just not true. Activists, feminist peace builders from right around the world were part of this movement. And some of you might have participated or remember Beijing Platform for Action and the real oomph that provided to then a sort of couple of years later lead to this UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So the acronym for that is UNSCR 1325. You might see that written down a lot. And there's a couple of other acronyms on here. So WROs, that's women's rights organizations, and CSOs, civil society organizations, meaning that the difference is that in civil society, you have a whole wide range of people who are being active for a lot of different issues that they, that they're supporting and working for. Women's rights organisations are specifically focused on women's rights. So it's often differentiated in the literature around that. But all's to say is the achievement of 1325 was on the back of really almost a century of very specific activism, of which WILPF was a strong part of. So Sheila has already noted this to us. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is, I think in some ways helpfully, has these, what we call pillars. So 4 pillars. The problem with creating pillars, in my view, is that there's one that underpins all of them. It's prevention. Conflict prevention. And this is the root causes aspect of what the Women, Peace and Security agenda says. So unless we transform the systems, the patriarchal, militarized systems that are causing women to not be able to participate, to continue to be unsafe and need protection, and to be unable to engage in relief and recovery efforts. The reason because of that is this issue around the root causes being, not actually shifting, changing, and transforming. So for me, that sort of, I see them more as the prevention here and the participation, protection, relief, and recovery, because but they're all interconnected. And I think that that's a really other important aspect of the WPS agenda. Unless you see all of them together, and an example of that is you can't just support women to participate in activities, in peace processes, in security sector reform, if it's not safe for them to do it, i.e. the protection part of it. And often these two things are seen as hugely separate by donors and by people who design programs around these. And it's been hugely problematic. And we know how many human rights defenders, women's rights activists are killed on an annual basis, because these understanding about how all these things are connected is not actually put into practice. So I guess what I'm hinting here is it's an imperfect implementation of this agenda, yet in some ways it is helpful to see these different aspects and these different parts of the pillars. So the prevention work, a lot of that work is about doing really good what they call gender sensitive analysis. So really understanding the context in which women, the work around women, peace and security will be, and really trying to think about how these root causes could be unpacked. The participation, the focus for a long time was around representation, i.e. getting women to sit on a seat in a room and be there. And we focused a lot of the programming for the first, 10 years on women's empowerment. And it was recognized that that was in many ways ineffective, because it didn't focus on those women actually being able to impact discussions in those spaces that they were representing in. And the whole effort should be more on how to get women to be able to influence decision making in those spaces, and what could be done around that, including working with men who were decision makers in those spaces and helping shift attitudes and getting them to be allies in supporting women to do the work that they need to do. So, you know, there's been real shift, real trajectory in understanding actually what is needed to get women to meaningfully participate. A huge amount of the work has been around protection, particularly around conflict-related sexual violence, and I'll talk about that as we look at the acronym. So that's CRSV, conflict-related sexual violence. And of course, we know that in a lot of the contexts, including work that the UK government has done around, and I'll use another acronym, preventing sexual violence, PSVI initiative. So that was something that you might remember was a big push from the UK government about, I'm going to say 10 years ago. Still important, still critical in places, you know, from a policy perspective like Sudan, and much needed. Ukraine, I'm thinking of lots of other spaces. You know, this hasn't become any less critical to the work, but in some ways it's interconnected in with the other pillars a little bit more, which is really important, helpful. Relief and recovery. In some ways that speaks to a lot of the work done in humanitarian spaces. Again, there's a huge focus on, say, the work of grassroots networks in Sudan right now who are providing relief and recovery, often led by women, really tailored work that's being provided to women and girls, and really, you know, think about what do older women need, what do younger women need, you know, really, really excellent grassroots work that's coming from women's rights organizations on the ground in contexts around the world. So again, really grounded, really helpful, really critical work. And these are the sort of actions and implementation that has happened under the WPS pillars. So I took a bit of time to explain it, but I think it's sort of helpful. Sheila said that there are 10 WPS resolutions altogether. These are them. So UN Security Council Resolution, SCR, is each of them a little bit different, and they've helped build a landscape in international humanitarian and international law about what is important to be considered as part of the WPS agenda. So you'll note, you know, something that's important to our group in the UK is UN Security Council Resolution 2242. So this is in 2015. This is the first time that climate change was mentioned within the WPS agenda. There's some really important ones that came up. The most recent ones, 93, pardon me, so women's roles in peacekeeping processes, acknowledging those mechanisms really have been absent with women, led by the UN. You can see that a lot of them are participation focused. The other aspect of them is around protection, so around thinking about how sexual violence happens within conflict and post-conflict contexts, and the support that required this monitoring mechanisms and involving survivors in those processes, accountability mechanisms, and having a survivor-centered approach around conflict-related sexual violence. So these are big shifts that have happened within the sector as a whole, like women's rights sector, and within work that happens in peace-building spaces. There are a lot of things that aren't talked about in these WPS resolutions, or they're just mentioned. And in some ways, the reason that you can see that there's a big gap, that the resolutions have not been built up since 2019, is a direct impact of the global pushback against gender rights and against gender equality norms. And I think states within the UN, including the UK, have not wanted to push for further resolutions because the feeling is that they will get watered down. meaning that the language will take back the rights that have been gained through these mechanisms. And professionally, I agree with that. I think it's a really big, it's the reality right now, but it does leave us with a gap. We haven't got a framework to respond to things that are happening right now, like technologically related gender-based violence, the violence that happens in digital spaces. We haven't got references to the importance of men and boys. Sorry, I should say there are some references in these, but there's not a stronger resolution that really ties the experiences of men and boys to gender equality more broadly, which I think is a gap in the WPS agenda as a whole. So other people, depending on what you work in, you'll know that there are gaps. But my explanation for that is because of this pushback and the desire not to water down what has been achieved so far. Really open to sort of talking about that a little bit more. Turning the resolutions into action. So you know that we're on our UK 5th National Action Plan on WPS. So this is the mechanism that is mandated within UN Security Council Resolution 25 that forces, or not forces, it gives an accountability mechanism by states to their population and they have to set out how they are going to implement the WPS agenda. So it's a really critical document. There is a whole industry around basically developing these, setting them up, seeking to monitor them. The most recent one was, I think, Colombia's one that was finalized in March last year. It's an incredibly progressive one. It explicitly talks about the role of LGBTIQ plus people, the interlinking of gendered rights for all people. It talks about men, it talks about violent masculinities. It's really interesting NAP. A lot of NAPs, the importance of NAPs is not just about looking outwards, but also implementing this inwardly. And of course, for example, WILPF's been part of GAPS, which is the sort of network of all the organisations in the UK who work on gender equality, peace and security. And for 4 NAPs under the UK, GAPS advocated for a domestic focused NAP. This has been achieved for the UK in its 5th NAP, where it looks at Northern Ireland, it talks about asylum seekers, and it talks about climate impacts. It also has a link, which I'll show in a sec, that is around transnational threats. And this is the hook that this government is using primarily to pull an outward-facing national action plan inward, a focus on domestic national security. I'll talk about that a little bit more. There are also regional action plans. So there's an ASEAN one, there's an AU, which is the African Union. There's also an EU regional action plan. So all states under these regions also sign up to particular implementation targets around WPS, and that's often around, there's also things that relate to that around having women's mediation networks and other sort of projects or plans that help to implement these plans. There's also local action plans. For example, in Mindanao, where there was a conflict for decades, there is a Bangsamoro action plan in the southern Philippines. And when I talk to people who were developing it and now implementing it, they said it's incredibly helpful to have a local action plan, because it really grounds the work of activists and highlights it and allows them to apply for funding. So and gives accountability mechanisms back up to the national space. So they're actually really cool. And I'm wondering if anyone later wants to comment about like what that would look like for Scotland, for example, which I know has been part of discussion. So I think they're really, really interesting mechanisms. I should add There's a lot of criticism about NAPs not being effective, not being accountable, both to people domestically and to people outside, for example, outside the UK. And there are real issues with monitoring whether or not, where the funds go, whether or not these promises happen. And it's, there's sort of tricky aspects to this mechanism. At a global level, there's a lot of different ways in which the commitments around the WPS agenda are managed and monitored. So you've got the resolution itself and the national action plans. You've also got CEDAW, and oh my God, I'm so sorry because my brain just like frizzled, and it's going to come to me, or maybe I need to Google it. But basically, that was adopted by the General Assembly in 79, and states need, oh wait, I've got it. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So that was a really critical sort of pre 1325 framework, and it was sort of the International Bill of Rights for Women. And it stated that all countries must end discrimination against women and girls. So it's much broader than just in conflict context, which is what 1325 was for. So it's a sort of combination of thinking about, well, what does CEDAW mean for, everyday, all lives of women and girls? And then what are the additional obligations that a state has that accompany having the women, peace and security agenda? So they're not in opposition at all. The WPS deepens the commitments of CEDAW. And when states report against CEDAW, which they need to do, they have to include how they are implementing the WPS agenda. So it's sort of considered to be an add-on, if you know what I mean. The recommendation 30, that was the human rights space where CEDAW sits in the UN framework is a place where sometimes there's a bit more flexibility. I mentioned that people don't want to fight for a new UN Security Council resolution, but GR 30, I think, is only, I'm going to get this wrong, it's only a few years old, and it has specific mentions in there that relate to aspects of 1325, which have deepened 1325 within the CEDAW space. So whilst the Security Council remains a very contested space for gender rights, there has been a little bit more room within the Human Rights Council where the CEDAW sits. And that place has been one where, in some ways, the continued deepening of women's rights agenda has been able to happen. But that was still a few years ago, and I understand that space has, again, become very difficult to build upon. I know less about the WPS HA compact, so I won't comment on it. The SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm going to reference myself here because I have a little note. No. All right, that's great. That just shows how complicated this is because I cannot even remember what the VNRs are. So look, this is what I mean. A, I'm not an expert. B, it's bloody complicated. In doing so, I'm going to move us to just having a little look at the current NAP. So our National Action Plan goes till the end of next year. The UK government has told us that they are in the process of doing a refresh. So they announced that about 6 months ago, and we understand that it's not going to be finished tomorrow. So it may take another 6 months. GAPS has said in a recent, Eva from GAPS has told us that they are asking the question of the UK government, well, look, if you need to deliver a new one by the end of 2027, maybe the refresh should just become the new one, given the time that it takes. It takes about a year for the UK government to go through the process of delivering one. They've said no, they are going to provide a refresh. The refresh, we understand, may include the following, but I'm just going to explain. The current one is jointly owned by the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Ministry of Defence. That's really normal to have a common, multi-departmentally owned national action plan. In fact, it's a good thing. But interestingly, both of those have sort of technically seen them as being outward-facing departments. Now, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office and many other internal government agencies are responsible for delivering projects that relate to women, peace and security. So the question is, will the refresh formally add on these additional departments, as it did, for example, in my home country in Australia? As the domestic focus turned inwards, it included departments dealing with things like immigration, asylum seekers, Indigenous affairs, health, all these aspects which we know paint a picture of what a human security looks like. So questions remain about what this refresh will entail. The current NAP focuses on decision making, so that's like participation, gender-based violence, GBV, which is relates to protection, humanitarian and crisis response, that relates to relief and recovery, security and justice, that sits across a couple of them. It sits across both prevention, protection, and participation, transnational threats. So this is something which is very much focused on what are the aspects of violence and discrimination that happen, and how does this impact both national security for the UK, assets of the UK, but also how might that impact global rights and global sort of global gender rights. So the last one's interesting. It's quite flexible, but it has often been read as a national security focus. And the question for us is, in this refresh, will there be an enormous shift and focus on transnational threats? And then what does that mean for WILPF UK? What do we want to advocate in terms of the strategic objectives? What do we see as most important for our work? If we're talking about demilitarization and we're talking about sort of a feminist lens on what are human security threats for globally and here in the UK, then, we've got like some really interesting things to say about that. Will we see it reflected in the NAP? Maybe not, but this is a point where maybe we've got an opportunity to share it, and we're certainly part of consultations through GAPS mechanism with the government. And for example, the Ministry of Defence wants to hold a series of consultations in 2 weeks' time, which hopefully Mackie, Eliza and I can attend, where we can feed into this process of refresh. So I'm going to go back a bit more into the acronyms, because I know that we're all I just I know that they feel really overwhelming, so I just wanted to maybe highlight some of these. Gender-based violence, I want to differentiate as different from VAWG, which is VAWG. So everyone says VAWG, which is violence against women and girls. This is very specifically about women and girls, whereas gender-based violence is broader than just women and girls violence. It's gender-based violence, so it can include men and LGBTQI plus people. Conflict-related sexual violence is specifically talking about violence that happens in the context of conflict and war environments. And for example, that's often counted. Some projects count how much of this is reported. You know what I mean? So this is often used both for data reasons to differentiate between the different types of violence. And for example, there's been a huge uptick, like a huge increase in conflict-related sexual violence. I think ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and adding on violence that's happened in particular in places like Sudan. So that's been a real increase in the last few years, when it was actually slowly declining before that. Sexual exploitation and abuse, and this is I was about to say, I do know this acronym has just jumped out of my head, but it's different from rape. It's more when people are, sex trafficking, serious organized crime, human trafficking, stuff like this comes under this acronym. So I'll show SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence. This is acknowledgement that there's a difference between sexual violence, which comes within the category around rape, and gender-based violence, which can include the next one, TFGBV, technologically facilitated gender-based violence. So this is violence that happens online. So sexual and gender-based violence is a really broad spectrum of violence. And people will use these terms sometimes as if they are the same thing. And you can see that there's just these really subtle differences, but I'm just explaining them because you might see them in a research paper or policy paper you look at and sort of say, oh my goodness, what's that? The one at the bottom, technologically facilitated gender-based violence, is getting a lot of attention right now, and rightly so. It's enormous statistics of women who are in public roles who are experiencing technologically facilitated gender-based violence. It's something like, 85% of politicians and women journalists are experiencing this. So it's just really shifted the landscape of who's experiencing this gender-based violence and the way in which they're experiencing it. And should I say that the evidence is also showing us that TFGBV is often moving into people's real lives. It doesn't just stay in the screen. So that's actually a really important aspect of this shift, and how, I know it's a horrible thing to say, but how violence is moving with all the different spaces that we work in. And I think it speaks so strongly to WILPF's analysis of there being this deeper patriarchal society where it doesn't matter what institution you're in or what space you're in, there is this way of male violence and sort of patriarchal violence sort of making its way into these spaces, right? And that they're often got deep gender biases built into them. These are some of the other acronyms that you might see. These ones are related to security contexts. I'm just going to briefly explain them because I think, you might come across them. So SSR, you may well have seen that many times before. So that's security sector reform. DDR is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. So they are really specialist and technical aspects of security sector reform. Security sector reform is the overarching work that happens within security institutions, which includes everything from the police to the military to intelligence services. And within that, there is work that disarmament, so taking the guns away, demobilization, taking people who were fighting for, non-state armed groups, and going through a process of taking them out of that group. And reintegration is when these people are then supported to go back to the communities where they came from or who will receive them. So there's people who specialize in each part of this. And it's important because we know not only are women and girls involved in these processes, and historically security sector reform and DDR just didn't even think, well, what will women need when they go back into communities? And, you know, the big problem, for example, when that happened in Colombia, where there are a lot of women fighters, almost all these women got pregnant really, really fast, because before they were colleagues, you know, who hadn't, been, I guess I was going to say, they didn't need contraception, but then they were sent back to these communities. And, you know, some of them have been fighting since they were small young girls, or they just, you know, that information hadn't been provided to them. And within the demobilization reintegration, they needed sexual health education and support and all these other aspects of, you know, what going back into society. And of course, the men needed them as well, but the women really needed them, and they weren't provided with them. So that's often been an issue. Countering violent extremism, you might see PVE, which is preventing violent extremism. So CVE, PVE, often used interchangeably, but that's an acronym that comes up with this security work. Responsibility to protect, it's not used so much anymore. This was something that came out of the Bosnian War. It is a sort of principle that was accepted in the international space. I would say it's not anymore. And Gaza is one of the things that has completely blown it to shreds. It's an idea that states, when they see things like genocide happening, that they need to step in and prevent it. And that's I should say it was Rwanda as well, which was one of the states that really pushed that agenda. No more. It's not really seen as being, I don't know, I don't have the right word for it, but within the humanitarian sphere, this is not something that's brought forward in the last few years. Peacekeeping operations, PKO, protection of civilians, POC. Protection of civilians, of course, that links back to protection within the WPS agenda. And there's a lot of really important gender elements of that, I should say. Peace architecture, I don't know how much you want me to go into this. How is everyone doing? Do we need to have a stretch? You know, I can see some of you haven't fallen asleep completely, but I was teaching a course the other week for some really interesting colleagues, and somebody just said, look, can someone just lay out what the heck you're talking about with track 1, track 2, and track 3? This is the very specific, like, brief version. So track 1, these are the sort of official negotiations. This is, you know, if you could actually get Zelensky to talk to Putin, this is these official government to government, or leaders of a non-state armed group talking to the state. It's often a very, very male-dominated space. They're very small, actual tables where these conversations happen. That's why they often hear the word tables. What I will say about this is it's hugely less linear. I mean, all these efforts are happening all over the place. So it's really important not to just track 1, track 2. But track 2 is sort of involves officials, involves serious decision makers from the context, in terms of, these might be like very senior business people, these might be faith leaders, these must be really credible you know, community governance leaders from the specifically from the context where the conflict or war is going on. They're often intermediaries. They're really well connected into track 1. They enable an environment of support within the society to really push for it and build the sort of credibility of the process that might be happening in the track 1. Track 3 is sort of seen as being grassroots peace building. It's seen to be the dominant place for women. Women work at all these spaces. The problem is that men don't value what's happening in the other spaces, and they don't want women, you know, to come into these spaces. But new data is saying that, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like 75% of all peace processes happening right now have women's leadership within track two and track three. So there's enormous amount of evidence about how vital, how busy and how amazing the work is being done by women. And the problem is that they're not influencing the next level. And so a lot of the work that happens around this is around creating channels of connection and influence. I already looked at the acronym CSO, Civil Society Organisation. You'll see I, International, NGO, non-government organisation. These are usually, the difference between the two is often that they are, I was about to say, the difference between a non-government organisation and a civil society organisation. Often in a country, there will be registration of organisations, and the NGOs are often registered and the civil societies are non-registered. But that is not a good, that would not be the only sort of, that's not a good explanation of it. And maybe I can think of a better one. WHRD, so Women Human Rights Defender. You might see that specifically. They use a lot in Latin American contexts. I think I mentioned no, I didn't. So also there's a number of meetings that happen globally. So you'll know that in March, we have the CSW, and WILPF will be represented there by Genevieve and our colleagues. I think Amrita will be going, and there's I think there's a delegation of women that IS is paying for people to come and speak in particular forums. But this year and last year, in line with Trump government restrictions to the US, so it's always held in New York, and it's sort of an annual review on the Commission of the States and Women. People do, states report on their commitments around women, and they including their WPS agenda commitments. And in and around that work are a huge amount of activism by women's led civil society around pushing for the rights of women, and including WPS work. There is, I was going to say, there's often a report by the UN Secretary General in October, and they often, it's now called, it's the WPS Open Debate, but they also call it WPS Week. So it's the other week throughout the year where women will come to New York and advocate for and support this work, but particularly around WPS is in October. So slightly different from March, but very specifically around WPS in October. There's also meetings within that architecture, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and reporting around CEDAW, which happens out of Geneva too, I think. So there's different mechanisms around state accountability for these rights-based mechanisms. But I think we, as WILPF, would say, the real accountability isn't there. If a state's not doing it, there's really very few mechanisms to push back against it. And, that's the problem with this sort of international architecture versus what's happening on the ground. So, but I hope that provides you with a little bit more, just so when you see these acronyms, you know what they mean. I'm just going to talk about, wait, how's everyone doing? Keep going. I've got 2 more slides. Okay, cool. Okay, so these are a couple of the other, these aren't acronyms. Oh, well, that's not true because FFP is. So we've got FFP, which is Feminist Foreign Policy. You would have heard that. We've had discussions about it here in the UK. The UK government has decided that they don't want to call their policy feminist foreign policy. I think, if you ask me, Mackie and Eliza, we'd say good, because there's nothing worse than saying you're doing something and really doing the opposite, which is what we could say the Germans have been doing. I think the Germans may have, I put a little star next to them, I think they've ditched their feminist foreign policy now, but they did, for example, provide enormous amounts of arms to Israel for the last few years and continue to call their work feminist foreign policy, which our WILF sisters in Germany have obviously been very active about, as well as the rest of the European sections, calling out governments who support militarism, support war, and genocide, and call it feminist foreign policy. So, I think the thing is we don't want them to misuse this word and such an important term, which is, what if we really did have feminist foreign policy? There's been real, it's an interesting sort of framing for us to, well, what would we really advocate for when we're talking about feminist foreign policy?
Excuse me a minute.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Pat has been locked out. Can you enable her to come in again? She's just been on the phone to me.
Oh, okay. I will try. I don't know what happened.
You work away at that. She's trying to get in again. Sorry, Sophia.
No, that's all right. I think I've talked about this before. Another word that has come up within the WPS agenda enormously in the last 10 years, a word that has been taken from Black feminist thinking in the US, which says, if you are, they said, look, if you're doing policy just for women and you don't think about the specific needs of Black women, you're not taking account of the real vulnerabilities and the real needs of these different groups of women. If you're not taking account of somebody with a disability who lives in a a refugee camp and is trying, is a married woman with 3 kids, you're having a totally different experience within you might be in the same space, but because of your identity, you have specific needs, interests, things that you need taking care of if you're actually supporting a women, peace and security agenda. So this concept of intersectionality is both understanding, identifying the specific needs of different people and transforming the root causes of their violence and insecurity. So it's a really interesting and important tool which has come forward through the WPS agenda in the last, I would say, maybe 10 years, that I have found personally hugely important and a critical lens to understanding how we can make our work more nuanced and more effective. I already ran through that acronym before earlier, and of course we've been talking about LGBTIQIA. So that's what each of the so we've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, that's used interchangeably, intersex and asexual, and plus means that there are other identities which are not named there, but there are other non-binary gender identities which are used in other contexts, such as, for example, in North American Indigenous communities use Two-Spirit to talk about people who are non-binary. Other terminology is decolonial feminism, so really challenging the Western-centered notions around WPS approaches. Radical inclusion, so this idea of sort of moving beyond representation to truly meaningfully impacting change in the context that is women are fighting for. I think you know what gender quotas means, but having really specific sort of legal instruments which which mean that within an election a certain percentage of women have to be elected. Critical mass, this is a sort of academic term, but what it is important for us to consider is that if you just put one woman in the room, it's not going to create the impact. Imagine being that one woman sitting there with 20 other men trying to create impact with your the constituency, your network of people that you're representing, the critical mass says, the evidence says that you need 30% of, in this case, women to make a real impact together in a space. And gender provisions is a word that you might have heard in relation to this. And it means that when you're drafting peace agreements, you have clauses, so they call them provisions, that actually reference both the needs of different people for a peace agreement. It might say things like, or it could be around having a gender quota, but it might say things like women and girls need to be taken account of in any DDR processes that involve, DDR, disarmament, mobilization, reintegration, that need to take account of them, or there's things like that that will need to be included in peace agreements, and we call them gender provisions. And my final slide, which maybe I can come back to if we have time, but it's a nice one that I use that my dear friend Kate Buchanan developed, and it just gives you a bit more information about what we're saying when we're talking about meaningful participation. But I might take the slide down and open us up for a chat, because I've taken ages, and sorry about that. Go ahead, Paula.
I was hoping it was in the question. So one thing, I think it's wonderful, all the naps and all the rest of it, but what worries me, there was only 109 countries that had them. And what clout has anybody got for, say, Afghanistan to have one? When you look at what's happening there, is there any clout from anybody to force anything? If that makes sense.
No, I mean, this is the issue. I'm going crazy here. Like, did Afghanistan even have an app? Maybe it did.
I'm guessing they haven't.
But now, well, they're definitely not going to work on it now, right? So you're right that what is the accountability mechanism around these things? And this has always been the problem with like international legal frameworks, is what does a sanction look like? And you know what, have we ever sanctioned, not just the UK, but has there ever been sanctioned for someone for not doing their signal requirements? And you know what, and there's so many countries that have these things in place and do not adhere to them. Like, we in civil society have been fighting for ages for the UK to report, and it doesn't really tell us the details of what has been happening. Yeah, so we have a shadow report, as do many other countries, meaning that civil society writes a report card for their government, and they make that public. Oh, Ludmilla, lovely to see you. Yeah. Did anyone have any other acronyms that they were thinking about? They haven't had explained.
Well, you don't know until they turn up in text or something.
I know, Sheila, they're everywhere, and everyone
They're everywhere,
pretends
yes.
that everyone else knows what they mean. I took ages to work out Vorg. Yeah, go ahead, Kath.
Yeah, so my question, I think, is that you've made reference a couple of times to yourself and Mackie being involved in those wider discussions. And I guess I'm not feeling fully appraised of how WILPF UK, through yourselves, gets involved in our influencing of all those structures.
Yeah, no, really good point. So WILPF UK pays an annual membership to join GAPS. GAPS, the acronym, is Gender Action for Peace and Security. So it's been around for, I'm going to get this wrong, but I feel like it's at least 15 years. So it is a network of, and I'm also going to get this wrong, but I feel like it's about at least 25 different organizations. And it's like got the, like us, it's got the big peace building ones like Safer World, International Alert, CARE. It's got the humanitarian ones, so also CARE, but like Save the Children, La-di-da. And then it's got smaller organizations, some who do like, it's got Rethinking Security, it's got others, and there's sort of academics that also join it who write on WPS and want to engage. So it's quite a vibrant and broad group of folks. A lot of the people who do it are a combination of being the head of advocacy for policy for their organization, and then you get the technical specialists. Like when I was the head of gender and peace building for Conciliation Resources, I repped on it. So it's a real mix of people. And in that way, the conversation's really interesting. For WILF, we share it in terms of attending different meetings between me, Mackie and Eliza. And we, although, like obviously anyone else can attend, but sometimes if it's an in-person one, and sometimes they get us to go and, we went to something the other week and the foreign minister was there and she gave a speech about women and girls, how this is her new big priority. Except what I understand is there's no money behind it. Okay, so what does that actually mean? If she wants to make it her priority, guess what? You've got to put money behind it and you've got to put technical expertise behind it in order to deliver on that. So there's a real, mismatch. And part of what WILF does is advocate for continuing to have WPS at the forefront of not just foreign policy, but domestic policy. So for a long time, it has focused on we need to include Northern Ireland. We need to include asylum seeker women and girls. We need to include climate. We need to include technologically facilitated violence. And they've been really strong they've always had a nice, strong director. Right now it's Eva Tabassum, who was used to be a WILF member, intern. Paula knows her well. She's fantastic. She's a younger brown British woman who's incredibly articulate. She reps so as part of GAPS, she goes on the all-party parliamentary groups. She speaks to ministers on behalf of this network, and she provides analysis and research, which we feed into, and they also coordinate the shadow report for the National Action Plan on an annual basis. So it's a hive of activity. We fill in where we can. We feed evidence, like Saskia, for example, from IS, who lives in London. She will often come in on those meetings. Like last week, we went to a meeting. I couldn't attend all day, but they're talking about, well, if there is a NAP refresh, I'll share the paper. Actually, it's just sitting on my inbox and I haven't sent it to you all, but it's a really great analysis of where the UK is now and the sort of critical moment, I would say, of what will this refresh look like? How far away will it take us from being able to transform those root causes of violence, the sort of demilitarization agenda, really having that connection in with climate justice. And yeah. I think
one of the people need to recognize that having gaps is our way of speaking to government. They gather together, these organizations, as Sophia said, but they regularly have meetings or are with government ministers, and they feed into this comment on the government's National Action Plan. So it's a sort of stage between us as just ordinary WILF members and our representatives on GAPS, and GAPS talking to the government. So we're doing the very thing that we say we do.
And in terms of then feeding into the UN meetings that you referred to, the March and the October sessions, is that all done by international, or how do you liaise with international around that feedback?
So I've just got an email in this afternoon from Barrett that is from the European section, like for our liaison work, and I need to review it, but it's giving us information. Do we want to feed in on anything in particular? And because they're putting together the international is putting together the talking points and the work that they want to do, and it sounds like there's already a few what they call side events. So these mean that they're not held within the UN, but WILPF has an office just across the road from the UN, and we also partner with the Quaker meeting rooms that are down the road from the UN's meeting, just within the same area of New York, and where you can meet with, have an event where you can have more people attend. So if there is something specific that we want to feed in, that happens through the international liaison team, through to Europe, through to IS. So it's a boom, boom, boom sort of thing.
Yeah.
And also we used to send delegates, like as in UK WILPF could go, and particularly if you, like, I think Anya went, I'm going to get it wrong, was it 2 years ago? Finance group, we had to approve it. But yeah, so we definitely, we've prioritized our younger colleagues in recent years, and to be very specific, we've prioritized getting Global South colleagues to attend these meetings, but you know why, it's climate stuff. But I should say, for example, with the climate justice work, the WPS, the sort of focus is, we know that women are leading climate adaptation work in conflict zones and generally, but they're excluded from a lot of the climate negotiations. So the link with that and WPS is that WPS is demanding their inclusion, their meaningful participation. It is saying that, environmental defenders need to be protected because they're incredibly unsafe. They're being huge numbers of people are killed globally, women who are defending the environment. And we know that in terms of adaptation, women should be core to deciding what happens in their communities. And those are the aspects of the hooks of the WPS agenda, which you can use to draw down to what you're saying. So you state, UK, you've signed up to this, and therefore, if you're making decisions on flood planning across, southern, UK, women need to be on that. Community groups need to be on that. And you know what I mean? Like, this is the local hook to that broader global agenda.
Yep. That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Any other exciting acronyms or questions? I'm only laughing because I don't know the answer to all the acronyms.
I put the NDV in the chat, by the way. VNR, sorry, the VNR was voluntary national review of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. And what I would say about that, and this goes to your point about accountability, voluntary, like, if they do it, nobody's going to pull them up on it, Yeah.
Afraid so. So are we, Sheila, is this wrapping up time?
Well, we've got plenty of time left.
I wasn't sure what our scheduled timing was.
We say 90 minutes is available. Obviously, it depends on people having something to say. I mean, the whole thing about the United Nations, how much do people feel the whole concept has been weakened by the role that America is taking? Because it seems that United Nations is a voluntary organization of states that sign into it. Everyone wanted to be in it at a certain point. Then when significant people like the United States are withdrawing, how does that weaken the whole thing? I don't know whether people have got different people have got different views on this, but it worries me because we have all these mechanisms, CEDAW and the CSW, where we're pushing for women. And as you say, in this current climate, there's been a big backlash, and all these revelations that are coming out, they concentrate on specific people and so on. But what we're seeing is there's an absolute network of men with power who can rule the world, because they can do what they like, wherever they like, until they're found out in some way. And it really, it gets to me.
I agree. I mean, I think it's actually wonderful if United States aren't in it. We might actually get somewhere, but that's just my personal opinion.
Could I ask a question, please, Sophia? I found that so helpful. I can't tell you, it's just brilliant, the way it's all built layer on layer. You were saying that the UK NAP is Foreign Commonwealth Office and Ministry of Defence, and that the next one will have some other agencies as well.
Maybe.
Maybe. To what extent might GAPS and UK WILPF agree with some of the content? I mean, are there helpful things that go into it from government? I'm not sure to what kind of percentage you would agree with or want to review or want to abolish.
Yeah, I mean, we're really thinking about this. Like, what is it that we want to push for within, like, gaps within the WPS team? Eliza, Mackie, Janet, and I really want to sit down and talk about this. But of course, everyone's welcome to input in this now that you know exactly what we're talking about, right? Historically, I mean, the thing is, I think the thing is there's been a lot more public support and support within those agencies for aspects of the NAP for a long time. But I think that that's shifting. And I think it reflects this global movement that Sheila's talking about. And I think that there is a hesitation on many organizations and individuals about this issue of holding the line versus pushing for a radical feminist agenda. And I think that our WILPF sisters in IS and lots of other global spaces are like, a bit like, fuck it. Those NAPs have not really done what we wanted them to do. They've allowed states to pretend that they're doing this work, and they haven't deeply investigated and started to transform those root causes of conflict. So maybe what Sheila's talking about, what you're talking about, like, what do we want to say now? Is this the point where we don't want to acquiesce anymore? And we want to say, you know what? In some ways that got us, we might be nice. We might say, look, they got us somewhere, and they certainly opened up a conversation and they created frameworks at a national level, but there's been real issues in implementing it. And we haven't got down to the core of what we really wanted these to be, which was around conflict prevention. We wanted to stop these things that continue to cause inequalities and injustice. And these mechanisms are not doing the job. Question is, what would? And what is it that we want to fight for and advocate for? I think your question is entirely relevant and valid. And I'm not sure that we've collectively got a grasp on what it is that we're asking for. And I think it's because this moment is I mean, like right now, it's so tense in this global space, we feel like we're losing so much. And yeah, I understand that mechanism of just holding on to what you've got because it seems like something. But I don't know if that served the change that is required well. Yeah, Kath, go.
So absolutely sympathise with both of those sort of points. I guess one of the things is that although GAPS, as you said, has a number of organisations involved with it, I don't, without knowing who they all are, I wonder how much our, as you were saying, bring it back to more local, how much our local civil society is aware of this, and whether, so while we have that framework, is there more that we could be doing at the ground level to enable women in communities, women in groups or whatever? We had that conversation at the exec about the Women's Institute. Is there a way of empowering women on the ground to have more influence, given that the government has that context that we could be? I think it's really important what you said about it not being the women, the Ministry of the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence. It should be all government ministries. And we should be looking at it in how do women in that context feed up what they think should be happening. And maybe that would be the next step. So it's not about saying we don't want the NAPs. It's about saying in order to enable the NAPs to really happen, more needs to be done by all of us, including us, to make women aware of it and enable that activity at the local level. And as you said, I mean, one of the things that is going to be so relevant for women in communities going forward is the impact of climate on villages and areas and all of those things, which the issue of food security that we're talking about elsewhere, that those are issues that you could then feed up into the mechanism.
Look, Kath, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that would be an enormously impactful way to revitalise the WPS agenda, is to localise it. So the paper that I wrote with some friends and, published last year really highlighted the local action plans. But what it meant in that was, what we meant by that was for people to understand how the WPS impacted their lives and what, in reality, human security means for the average person in the UK. And you're right, it doesn't look like a war. It looks like, having access to flood plans that make sense for older folks and for kids. It means that we have, education that prioritizes harmony and not violence. It means that it goes into every single aspect of our lives. Our WILF sisters down in Australia have, for the last, every time a NAP is planned, Ludmilla and the sort of teams across Australia have been instrumental in creating essentially gaps. And then what they've done is go round Australia and do consultations paid for by the Australian government to understand what are the interests and needs under a WPS framework to help build in what would the next NAP look like. I think that would be tremendous if we were part of doing that for the next NAP. And, I think doing it through the lens of climate justice, of inclusive education, through all these spaces that we know are what makes up human security for people here in the UK. yeah, I've talked about this with people in a couple of different organizations, and they all say, "Oh, wow, that's already been done, huh?" Like, oh, yeah, yeah, but nobody wants to give it any money. So, but I think the way that you explained it, maybe I should have rolled you out, Kath. I think what you're saying about the NAP, the WPS being relevant to people's lives now, I fully agree, but it just needs to be brought down to spaces where people can really think, like, what's going to help me and my family and my community feel peaceful and secure going into the future, and how will I bring in equality for all people in the communities that I'm in, and what needs to happen for that to happen, and can we not build that into what this looks like going forward? I think that would be a wonderful and valuable process. Helen?
I've got two different questions. Are you finished with the going down the way locally? How we did? Mine is about going up. And two, firstly, remember Madeleine Rees going on about how if you connected what was going on at international level with the local, like WILPF UK, could then lobby the UK government about the same issues, and so there'd be a link. Is that communication link still there?
I think it hasn't been so strong in the last few years. I think, well, what do others think? But I totally agree. I've spoken to Amrita in the last, year, and that is definitely her ambition, is to connect sections with international in a way that brings that back to life and reality. And I think that that's always been the ambition of that connection, and that the value, shall we say, of having a member-based global organization. But I think that for us in the WILPF UK, we haven't, I guess, benefited from that as much as some of the other sections. And I guess it's a bit of a question for us, like, what is it that we need and we want to do to revitalize that connection, given that our Secretary General now, as well as our past one, is reiterating how critically important that is for the movement.
Well, my other question is also about sorry, I haven't been very active for a while, so these issues have been covered. But I remember when UNSCR 1325 came in, and Wolf got very excited about it. And you're saying it hasn't really delivered in lots of ways. And I wondered, it seems to me that maybe, is there anyone training women to move up from what was it, level 2 up to actually be able to work with men that you disagree? I mean, how do you learn to work with men at that kind of level?
That's so in the last 10 years, there's been quite a proliferation globally of women mediator networks that are funded regionally, usually. The UK provides funding for the Commonwealth-wide regional mediation network, and this, not, I won't say the sole aim, but a primary aim of those networks is to be able to identify senior, experienced, legitimate, like very credible women to be able to continue to train and support them to get up into those spaces. So they have been, like, this is sort of the work that I do professionally. And I would say that the continued barrier around that is the decision makers about who gets to be in those spaces still continues to be, even the women in those spaces are still prioritizing men, but like you know, I'm just thinking they're you know, for example, the UK will hopefully have a real role in deciding who's the new Secretary General's representative in I think Libya, in Yemen. You know, because the very credible chap's gonna, you know, finish his term in a year or so, or less than a year. And the thing for me is, well, why the hell is it not going to be a woman? Like, and why the hell isn't the UK already like pounding on, like, we've got 3 amazing women, you should be, you know, starting to, you know, check their skills anyway. It's the sort of system which is preventing women from getting in those spaces. It's not that they're not there, and it's not that they don't know exactly where they are. So, but I would say there's an enormous amount of work to do to get those women and to, you know, have them ready to rumble, and you know, and that they're absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Pat, did you have something you wanted to come in on before we finish?
Just
Pat, you're muted.
Thank you. First of all, a big thank you to Sophia for making a very complicated subject so much clearer. So thank you for that. And I'm thinking about the fact that we often want to get new people involved with things in WILPF. And this is such a complicated subject, and it's got so many abbreviations and layers of things happening. It's not entirely obvious how anybody can get involved or do anything towards this at a very a starting level. And what I'm thinking about is whether there is any merit in putting together some sort of guidance on this, bringing it a connection between what happens at the very top level and the things that you've just been talking about, how it affects us on a day-to-day basis. And if that could be written down as a sort of little pamphlet, and then when somebody says, I'd like to get involved with WPS, what on earth is that? You've got something to tell them and to give them and suggest how they can get involved.
I was just thinking, Pat, we did get, Paula and I got an email this week about an enthusiastic student. Paula, I'm just wondering whether or not we should ask them if this is the topic that they could do for us. I mean, I think
I did invite her to come to this tonight, but she didn't come in. So
okay,
yes,
well, see
I'm
how
with you.
she is. But I do agree with you, and I think it's probably one of the trickier. I don't know. I mean, I think just the fact that we've had this talk for an hour and a half, you're correct. It is tricky. It's hard to make the connections. It's hard to ground it in our own practice as feminist peace builders. It shouldn't be, but it is. And finding a way to explain why that international architecture is important, and more importantly, how we can use that as UK WILPF. I agree with you. I think it'd be enormously important. And I would also really like us to come up with, well, what is it that we want GAPS to do? Like, what are we fighting for in the next few years? I think that we are a bit unclear about that. And I'd love for us to be able to spend some time, you know, bringing that together. And maybe that is, you know, if they, you know, we do have a little time to have someone's thinking and research behind it. And even if it's not perfect, it just helps us set the scene and put something small but clear together. I agree with you. I think it would make a difference.
Good. Well, on that note, we have taken up our 90 minutes. So it's been a really interesting and useful conversation built on so much information that you've helped us to find our way through, Sophia. So thank you very much. And thank you all for attending.
It was